Hello, I'm Dr. Winston York, and today I'd like to talk to my fellow Canadian Conservatives about proportional representation. Proportional representation is a very simple idea. It proposes that the number of seats a party gets in Parliament should correspond to the number of votes that the party receives. More votes, more seats. Less votes, less seats. What we do instead today, under First Past the Post, is assign seats based on the ridings or geographic areas won by different parties. Conservatives typically dismiss proportional representation out of hand as a progressive idea. It seems like progressives want proportional representation precisely because it would permanently keep the Conservatives out of power by always allowing a coalition of the Liberals, NDP, and Greens to control Parliament. Conservatives typically agree with progressives that this would be the effect of proportional representation and are thus strongly opposed to the idea. But here we have something very strange. Conservatives and progressives agreeing about the effect of a government policy. This should really give conservatives a lot of pause. It should be seen as rather unexpected and odd that conservatives and progressives agree about the effects of proportional representation. Conservatives should really stop and think that something must be wrong about how they're looking at the situation if they're simply agreeing with progressives on this point. Why? Because progressive analysis of the effects of government policies are invariably simplistic and superficial. That's why progressive policies often sound like great ideas, but are actually terrible ideas once you understand the actual effects. Yes, a superficial analysis of proportional representation would lead one to believe it would benefit the left wing in Canada. However, I think a more careful consideration of the facts tells a different story. Conservatives in Canada are currently disadvantaged by First Past the Post and would benefit from proportional representation. The most obvious indication of this is that the Conservatives won the popular vote in the last two elections, but ended up well short of the Liberals in terms of seats both times. More people voted Conservative than Liberal, but the Liberals are the most powerful party in Parliament. We can also look at a historical record of Canadian federal elections. The Liberals win approximately two-thirds of the time. Since World War II, there have only been 3 prime ministers with Conservative majority governments: Diefenbaker, Mulroney, and Harper. In that time, there have been 6 Liberal prime ministers who won majority governments. Of those, Justin Trudeau is the only Liberal not to manage winning multiple majorities, so far. Mulroney is the only Conservative to manage winning multiple majorities. The thing that makes this more surprising is that during this entire time period, the Liberals have been competing with the NDP, or its predecessor, for left-wing votes. A superficial analysis of the situation would suggest that this would have been very bad for the left wing and lead to Conservative hegemony. But clearly it did not. Now, there's an obvious rejoinder. Canada is a progressive country. Of course it usually elects left-wing governments. That sounds like a plausible explanation, but it doesn't actually make sense. If Canada were simply a more progressive country, we would expect that our Conservative Party would simply become more progressive to match the country. Political parties adjust to the political landscape. They don't simply lose election after election. Furthermore, look at provincial politics in Canada. Liberal domination of federal politics has not translated into the provincial domain. If anything, it is the Conservative parties that have dominated provincial politics. Right now, 8 out of 10 provinces are governed by a centre-right government, including the 2 largest provinces, Ontario and Quebec. Now, it should be noted that what it means to be a centre-right government is very different from province to province. Quebec and Alberta may both have centre-right governments, but they are very different from each other. But that's my point. Provincial Conservative parties have adjusted to their political landscapes and thus been electorally competitive. But this has not happened at the federal level. Furthermore, I don't actually concede that Canada is a progressive country. It seems to me that Canada's government is more progressive than its population, and we can see this if we look at polling on various political opinions. Let me give you 3 examples. The first is abortion. Now let me be clear, a majority of Canadians consider themselves pro-choice and support the legality of abortion. Nevertheless, a majority also believe that there should be some restrictions, such as forbidding abortion in the 3rd trimester. And yet Canada has no law whatsoever regulating abortion. The second example is the lowering the flags to half-mast after the discovery of the graves near the residential school. A majority of Canadians were absolutely on board with this. However, a majority of Canadians also believe it's time to bring the flag back up. They believe we've sufficiently apologized for the evils done at the residential school and it's time to move on. Those flags, they remain at half-mast. A third example is CERB, money provided by the government to provide relief during the pandemic. A majority of Canadians are absolutely in favor of CERB. They think it provided an important role in getting Canadians through the pandemic. However, a majority also believe that it allowed people to stay home when they should have gone back to work. And there are numerous issues that you could bring up in the areas of economics, criminal justice, immigration, healthcare, etc., where more conservative policies would be supported either by a majority or a very strong minority of the population. and yet these same policies will not even be touched or even advocated for by the Conservatives, let alone come close to implementation. Now, to be clear, many policies that Conservatives would favor do not have the support of the majority of Canadians. Nevertheless, Conservatives could identify real Conservative policies that have support, campaign on them, advocate them, and potentially implement them. But they don't. To further this point, let's consider the Canadian political spectrum from right to left. First, we have the People's Party of Canada, which got around 5% of the vote in the most recent election. Then we have the Conservative Party of Canada, which got about 34%. Then we have the Liberals, which got about 33%. Then we have the Greens, who got about 2%. And then, leftmost of all, we have the NDP, who got 18%. Then there's the Bloc. They're difficult to classify on a life spectrum. The party itself is probably best described as center-left, but their voters are all over the map. Polling suggests that most Bloc voters support the center-right party currently governing Quebec. So we'll leave them off for now. Now, where is the center of the Canadian political spectrum? It's approximately a third of the way into the Liberal Party. That's without taking into account the fact that some Bloc voters would be on the center-right. The average ordinary Canadian is on the Conservative end of the Liberal Party. But we aren't governed by the Conservative wing of the Liberal Party. It seems rather that we're governed by the left wing of the Liberal Party. Canada's political centre is within the Liberal Party, but the party as a whole is well to the left of the political centre. Furthermore, the left wing of the party currently controls it, and through it the government of Canada. The consequence is that we are governed by a party that sits considerably to the left of the Canadian population. That's fundamentally why the Canadian government is more progressive than its Canadian population. The conclusion is further supported by observing that more Canadians voted for parties right of the Liberals than left of the Liberals. This is pretty consistent from election to election. The Liberals more or less represent the status quo of Canada. More Canadians want to move Canada in a more conservative direction from that status quo than those who want to move it in a more progressive direction. But let's look at the Canadian political spectrum in a different way. This graphic is from the polling company Abacus Data in 2020, where they divided Canadian electorate into 5 political ideologies. Now, one can certainly dispute or question their classifications, but I think it does capture something about the Canadian electorate. From left to right, we have the progressives with about a third of the population, the centrists with 22%, the free enterprise liberals with 12%, right populists with 23%, and simple conservatives with 10%. What I want to draw your attention to is that the progressives are a minority. They're a loud minority, and they do make up a substantial part of the electorate, but they are still a minority. Furthermore, the 3 right-of-center ideologies make up 45% of the vote, more than the progressives. But if that's true, why did the Liberals win? They win because they position themselves as a party of the center. They dominate the centrists, but also split progressives with the NDP and Greens, while also splitting the free enterprise Liberals with the Conservatives. Now, you may think, the Liberals aren't centrists, they're crazy left-wing progressives. Firstly, you have to think in terms of the center of the Canadian population, not your own political positions. Moreover, when I describe them as centrist, I'm really describing their political strategy rather than their political orientation. Their strategy is to capture the political spectrum between conservatives and more progressive parties like the NDP. They are in the center between those 2 parties. Now, the politicals are on the political left, even as I showed, compared to the Canadian population. And this, ironically, is actually due to the strength of support for conservative policies in Canada. Conservatives take up much of the electorate. The Liberals are forced left to pursue their centrist electoral strategy. Were the Conservatives weaker, the Liberals could be more centrist. Furthermore, the Liberal strategy works because Canadians are too conservative to vote for the NDP. We inherited our Liberal and Conservative parties from the United Kingdom, but there the Liberal Party was replaced by their counterpart to the NDP, the Labour Party. The Liberal Party was reduced to being a minor third party, but this did not happen in Canada because we have not been willing to support the NDP sufficiently for them to become the major left-wing party. That's what enables the 3-party scenario, which the Liberals have done such a good job of exploiting. But looking at these ideologies again, it tells us something about why the Liberals have been so successful compared to the Conservatives. The Liberals sit on the conjunction of progressive and centrist voters. They don't need to be very ideologically diverse because they are 2 of the most common ideologies, together making up over half of voters. A successful conservative coalition, on the other hand, has to bring together 3 distinct conservative ideologies and some portion of centrists. And while those 3 ideologies are conservative to one degree or another, they disagree strongly on many issues. It's very difficult to build a big tent conservative party that can attract voters of such diverse ideologies. Now, the typical conservative response to proportional representation is rooted in the idea that we cannot get a majority of Canadians on board with conservative policy ideas. As such, our only hope is to keep first past the post so that we can occasionally win a majority government when the left wing splits just the right way. Now, there are a couple of reasons why this response is incorrect. Firstly, we can get a majority of Canadians on board with conservative policy ideas. Whether we look at polling data, the political parties, or the political ideologies, we find that Canadian population is more conservative than our government. We should have the potential to win. However, even if I'm wrong, relying on a vote split, allowing a conservative government to implement policies opposed by a majority of the population, is just a losing strategy. Any policy worth implementing will be overturned after the next election when the vote no longer splits just the right way. Conservatives of all people should be above such short-term thinking. Insofar as we're in the minority, we know that we have to change hearts and minds, not play clever tricks. We need to get people to see the merits of conservative policy, and that's the only way to bring about positive, lasting conservative change. Well, what would the switch to proportional representation actually change? One important thing is that under proportional representation, every vote counts the same. Every additional voter helps a party gain seats in Parliament. It doesn't matter who those voters are or where they live. This is not the case under first past the post. In the status quo, some voters are more equal than others. Where you live matters a lot. If you live in the Greater Toronto Area, the parties do everything they can to win your vote because the results in those ridings are what largely determines who wins government. If you live in Quebec, the parties will also do almost everything they can to win your vote because those voters determine whether Quebec goes Bloc or Liberal, and that largely determines whether or not the Liberals end up with a minority or majority government. Now, if you live in most places in Alberta, you don't matter. Your riding is a foregone conclusion, and that's also true for the opposite reason if you live in the Atlantic provinces. Now, the issue is that conservative policies are good for everyone, and progressive policies, whether by design or an intended consequence, are good for special interest groups, while being quite bad for the population at large. When those special interest groups are concentrated in key riding, those progressive policies become an excellent way to buy votes and elections. Conservatives can't do this. They can't play that game, at least without abandoning their conservative principles. Now let me give you a concrete example. Supply management. This is a policy where the Government of Canada has created a government-enforced cartel controlling dairy, poultry, and eggs. This policy increases the cost of milk, chicken, and eggs for everyday Canadians and benefits a select group of farmers who are allowed to participate. It is, quite frankly, a policy that robs the poor to feed the rich. Now, why don't conservatives run on a policy of abolishing this terrible system and bringing cheaper food to everyday Canadians? Surely, making food cheaper would be a winning promise and a great campaign. Well, here's the problem. The Canadians who would welcome cheaper food are diffuse and spread out across all of Canada. The farmers who benefit from the status quo are concentrated in regions in Ontario and Quebec. Threatening their privileged position would result in the loss of many key ridings. The end result? Conservatives and everybody else don't even dare mention supply management. Now, another important change is that proportional representation would allow the existence of multiple conservative parties without splitting the vote. Under first past the post, the best strategy of conservatives is to form a big tent conservative party and try to hold diverse elements of conservatism together under the same big tent. But under proportional representation, the best strategy is to have multiple conservative parties which attract votes from different kinds of conservatives and then have those parties work together in Parliament. Multiple conservative parties would invariably attract more votes than a single big tent conservative parties. And this isn't speculative. We can see this every time there's been a right-wing vote split in Canada. So look at BC in the 1990s, Alberta in the 2010s, or the federal government in 1993 to 2000. When the vote splits, the total percentage of votes for the conservative parties increases, and when the vote unsplits, it goes back down. Furthermore, we aren't talking about, some small 1 or 2% shift. In BC's 1991 election, the combined Liberal social credit total was 57%. Now, after a number of elections where things returned to a more typical left-right battle, in 2005, the Liberals only get 46% of the vote. only 11% of the vote managed to make it through the merger. In 2000, the combined Progressive Conservative and Canadian Alliance vote was 38%, but when they merged in 2004, they only got 30% of the vote. 8% of the vote did not make it through the merger. It's not hard to see why this happens. It's difficult for one party to be all things to all conservatives, especially given the diversity amongst conservatives. When you have multiple parties, each party can specialize in representing a particular kind of conservative, and this is what happens in countries that use proportional representation. The parties are ideologically narrower, more precisely representing their voters. A voter may not want to vote for a particular conservative party for any number of reasons, but they have other conservative options available. But what kind of conservative parties could actually exist in Canada? Well, today we have the Conservative Party and the People's Party. Historically, we've also had the Reform Party and the Progressive Conservative Party. Some variants of those would likely exist in a proportional system. If we look to other countries, we find things that exist. For example, often a classical liberal party, which focuses on individual freedoms and free markets. Also, often there's a conservative Green Party, which is concerned about environmental issues, but is otherwise fairly conservative. Now, here in Canada, I think one thing that likely would exist is a home for the social conservatives. Now, obviously, there is overlap between all these potential parties, and they wouldn't all exist or be successful, but clearly there are a lot of different parties that could exist and would be able to attract votes. But a particularly significant party that I think would highly likely exist in proportional system would be a Francophone conservative party. So this is a conservative party that would appeal primarily to voters in Quebec. And one thing that would be very helpful would just be that they would always have a fluent French speaker articulating conservative positions in election debates. And that would be hugely helpful. Now, as it stands right now, Quebec is governed by a popular center-right government. And their premier actually endorsed the Conservatives in the recent election. Now, center-right in Quebec, it's not the same thing as center-right in the rest of Canada. And that's a large part of why conservatives have trouble winning votes. It's difficult to appeal to French conservatives and English conservatives. But a Francophone party that would adjust to the beliefs of Quebecers and attract those votes would actually be competitive and get votes in Quebec in a way that a Big Tent conservative party just cannot do. And I think another benefit of having multiple conservative parties would be shifting the political discourse. See, today in an election debate, there's one conservative and a whole bunch of progressives. This enables presenting the conservatives as crazy and out of touch and everyone else. But if there's multiple conservative parties, well, they would appear more moderate by comparison. It'd be much harder to present them off as crazy right-wing wackos when, well, no, I can see there's a variety of conservatives. There's not just one person giving these ideas, and yes, maybe some of those other conservative parties are crazy, but the mainstream one clearly isn't. But perhaps the key way that conservatives would benefit from proportional representation would be that it would hamper the liberal centrist electoral strategy. See, under first past the post, the liberals can get 40% of the vote, win a majority of the seats, and govern. But this doesn't work under proportional representation. Firstly, a big part of the liberal strategy is to portray conservatives as crazy, accusing them of wanting to do things like privatize healthcare, put soldiers with guns in Canadian cities, or ban abortion. And this approach serves two goals. Firstly, it scares progressives into voting for them, rather than risking splitting the left-wing vote. Secondly, it convinces moderates that the conservatives are crazy and they can't vote for them. Under proportional representation, there is no vote splitting. They cannot scare progressives into voting for them in order to block conservatives, because it just doesn't work. And furthermore, it makes it much more difficult to present all the various conservative parties as crazy right-wing wackos. And the consequence, I think, invariably, is that liberals are going to bleed votes left and right. They're going to be in a much weaker position. Secondly, they will be unable to govern on their own. Today, yeah, they can win an outright majority and do whatever they want. But under proportional representation, they will be reduced to a permanent minority. They'll have no choice but to work with parties either on the left or the right. But if they work with parties on the right, they're going to alienate their more left-wing voters. And if they work with parties on the left, they're going to alienate their more moderate voters. The centrist strategy just isn't going to work for them anymore. It's much harder for the Liberal Party's centrist electoral strategy to work under proportional representation. And they know this. That's why, after promising that 2015 will be the last election in first past the post, the Liberals broke that promise. When they talk about electoral reform, they don't want proportional representation, which, almost all proportional electoral reform is done, they want ranked ballots, because that would enable them to continue their strategy. But what would the actual outcome here be? Would adopting proportional representation replace liberal dominance with the dominance of a left-wing coalition? That's not an improvement from the conservative perspective. Or is it really possible for conservatives to win? Could conservatives get a majority of the population behind them? Well, we did, twice. In 1957, Diefenbaker won a majority of the votes, and in 1984, Mulroney won a majority of the votes again. And incidentally, those two wins make up half of all conservative majorities since World War II. They both did this by combining a similar coalition of Western populists, traditional conservatives, and Quebec nationalists. And when the Mulroney coalition imploded in 1983, these three groups each became their own party: Reform, Progressive Conservative, and the Bloc. The Liberals won that election candidly, but if you look at the votes, more people voted for the heirs of the Mulroney coalition than for either the Liberals or the NDP. In 1987 and 2000, the Liberals won decisive majorities, but they were very close contests if you look at them in terms of votes for a left-wing coalition or the heirs of Mulroney. Now, it's true, since 2004, a small majority of Canadians have voted for either the Liberals, NDP, or Greens. And that's because in that election, we went from two conservative parties to one with the merger of the Alliance and the Progressive Conservatives, while going from two progressive parties to three with the emergence of the Greens. Right now, the Progressives have three parties to choose from, and they only manage a small majority. Furthermore, Conservatives don't actually need to win a majority to govern. For some reason, people tend to talk as though Conservatives can't govern unless they win an outright majority of the seats. But people's memory seems really short. Harper was able to govern with a majority government for 5 years. He did it for 2 years with the support of the Bloc and 3 years with the support of the Liberals. In 2008, there was an attempt to supplant him with a coalition. Harper controversially prorogued Parliament. But this was only a stalling tactic. The coalition could have taken power if they had simply stuck with it. Instead, the Liberals decided they would rather leave Harper in power than govern with a Bloc and NDP. Why would they do this? Well, I think there's a very simple reason for this. Despite their rhetoric, the Liberals are more aligned with the Conservatives than the NDP. Those of us who are more conservative complain the Conservatives are liberal light. Outright progressives, on the other hand, complain that the Liberals are conservative light. And they'll tell you that the Liberals and Conservatives are splitting the right-wing vote. And if you compare the Liberal and Conservative platforms, discounting differences in rhetoric, they really aren't that different. Now, historically, the Liberals and NDP have never formed a formal coalition. The Liberals have at times relied on the support of the NDP. However, they've invariably given very little to the NDP in return for their support. Typically, they've simply implemented the policies they wanted, and often the NDP tries to claim credit for them. As a case in point, consider the implementation of Medicare in Canada. The NDP would like to tell you that they played a key role in bringing it to Canada. But the Liberals campaigned on introducing it in the 1965 election. It was their idea. They fell 2 seats short of a majority, but had the votes to pass Medicare even without NDP support. As such, I don't expect to see Liberal NDP coalition governments. Firstly, because I don't think they are going to actually have a majority of seats between them in order to form that coalition. But secondly, they actually aren't aligned enough to actually work together. Now, I have laid out a lot of reasons why I think Conservatives would be better off under proportional representation than under first past the post. And obviously, at the end of the day, there's limitations to attempting to predict what would happen under a changed electoral system. But what I think is that once you get past superficial analyses, the evidence does consistently suggest Conservatives would actually be doing better under proportional representation than they are in the status quo. Ultimately, though, I don't support proportional representation because it would help Conservatives. I support proportional representation because I believe it would make the government more closely reflect the population. I think this would help Conservatives because right now the government is more progressive than the population. But I believe that insofar as I and other Conservatives are in the minority in many issues, we need to change hearts and minds. And if we can change those hearts and minds and have an electoral system in which the government reflects the population, policy will follow.